So now that we're recording, we will talk a little bit about upcoming. We have next week, Krista Sievertson is going to be talking about autism assessment during COVID-19 in all three models. So in-person learning, hybrid, and distance learning. So that's going to be a great one next week if you get a chance to sign up for that. The registration link is in a later slide too. The week after that is still to be determined. A couple of possibilities going in that week. And the week after, on the 31st, Joe Shingen, who we've had before talk about Flipgrid, he's going to be talking about the new features in Google Meet. So if you're using Google Meet, there's some new features coming up. And we are doing office hours to make sure that around the region, we're sharing information specifically about assistive technology, but just about things that are supportive for teachers too, especially teachers and all staff and students as we're moving through these different models of distance learning, hybrid, everything for COVID. When we're doing and considering assistive technology, we often think about the SET framework, and that's the student, the environments, the tasks, and the tools. And then we always have a lens of equity that overlooks all of that, making sure that each student gets exactly what it is that they need. Today for our agenda, we're going to talk about why we collect data, what data we need to collect, how do we do that, collecting that data. We'll talk a little bit about your students or classes and apply it there. We'll have time for question and answers and a little wrap up at the end. To add a little levity, here's a Dilbert cartoon. I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made this one up. Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. How many studies showed that? 87. So we know it's easy to make up data, but we want to make sure that we're actually collecting data. So let's talk a little bit about that, why we collect data. Many of you have probably heard about the Council for Exceptional Children. The CEC has 23 high leverage practices, and those are the 23 practices that they say have the greatest impact on student performance in education. And so there are multiple HLPs linked to data collection, but these are just two of them, number 6 and number 11, talking about using student assessment data, then analyzing our instructional practices, and then making adjustments to improve student outcomes. And then number 11, tying those long and short-term goals based on data. Of course, there is a HLP, number 19, I think it is, that is using assistive technologies and instructional technologies. So lots of things that we're talking about today really tying into those HLPs. This is probably really difficult to read on your screen, but know in the slides you can enlarge it. It's the due process flowchart from the Minnesota Department of Ed. Basically what this is that the information in your evaluation report feeds into your IEP present levels, which then feeds into your measurable annual goals, then into your short-term objectives, and then into your progress reports. And all of that information then feeds back into that cycle, whether it's back into a new eval or into a new IEP. But all of that is based on data. And if we don't have that baseline data, that initial data and information, we don't know where to go from there. So we don't know what that next piece is. So it's really important to make sure that we've got the data in that piece. So here are some of those concrete reasons why we want to collect data. Parents can see their child's progress. We can report on that. IEP teams have that measurable data to be able to change our decision-making on what we're going to target, whether something's working or not. In assistive technology, it's like, is this the tool we want, or do we need to look at something else? Teachers have organized records of students' performance and then can evaluate their own instruction on how that's going. And then student learning is accelerated due to receiving appropriate instruction that we have, again, being shown through that data. Oop. And then, of course, it's federal and state requirements also that we're collecting data. And the big thing in regards to assistive technology, most of these things apply across all the time collecting data, but in assistive technology, many times we're asked to collect this data about a particular item or tool to prove that it's the item or tool that we want to purchase for that student. So a lot of times we'll check something out of a library, do a trial, collect that data, and then say either, yes, this really supports that student's learning, or no, we need to look at another tool or strategy. Then we get into what data do we collect? I think this is where a lot of people kind of get hung up. Like, what am I supposed to be collecting data on? I know you're telling me I'm supposed to be collecting data, but what does that even look like? What is that data? Um, Whenever we're looking at assistive technology or any data collection, we want to make sure that it's tied to the goals and objectives, those needs. We looked at that flow chart. It's those needs that are identified either in the eval report or in the present levels. So again, it's that baseline data that you've got. And that could be documented in your short-term objectives as a need, or in the accommodations and modifications. That's how that flows from the present levels. It's not that everything needs to be an objective, but it's that it needs to be addressed. And then I guess the key element regarding what is the data that we want to measure, it's like measure what it is that you want to change. And if any of you have been in a training with Jason Crane surrounding data, he will always make the point that whatever it is we are collecting data on, we will focus on. And so that is sort of this key element of wherever your attention is, that's where the change is going to happen. Another piece, thinking about what data we have collected, it can come from this set framework, right? So what am I collecting data on? You know about the student, the environment, and the tasks that you want them to do. Those are the needs that you have. And then now you've probably selected a tool in terms of assistive technology. So what is the tool that we're going to put in place to hopefully change how that student does on that particular task? So as an example, a student is going to use text-to-speech on a Chromebook to increase their learning comprehension, right? So you might give them comprehension questions that they either could read for a baseline, just reading a hard copy, and then reading with that tool. So reading with a text-to-speech screen reader or something like that. So, and then showing that progress that way. There are, the number of data collection sheets out there is infinite. The links on this page, again, the print is real small to see, but the examples on there, there's a goal tracking sheet, and that one is from the Council for Exceptional Children. It is a very complex sheet. I'm actually going to click on it and share that tab with you, just so you can see what it looks like. It's a Google sheet. Oop, it just stopped sharing. 1 second, please. It doesn't like to switch tabs for me very much. Here we go. Oop. There it is. And again, very small, but you can see that this is looking at several different objectives here. They've got the objectives up at the top, the date in the left-hand column, how many they got right out of how many, and then it's figuring a percentage, and then space for notes. So this is really kind of a comprehensive data collection sheet. So I just wanted to show you that in comparison to, and I'm going to try to switch tabs, but I might have to reshare. Sure enough. All right. Here we go. I'll go back to the presentation, but the other one linked on there is, I call it Julie's favorite data collection sheet, and it is a super generic data collection sheet that basically says in the column, insert here what it is you want to change. So whatever it is that you are wanting to change is the piece that you'll be collecting data on. You would have the date on there, the activity that you're doing, and then if it's, some behavioral task that you're trying to change, that's what would go in that column. Your district buildings co-ops might have preferred forms to use, but I've seen people use everything from Post-it notes and label stickers to printed out fancy forms and online forms. So just know that there are tons of options out there for how your data is, how it's collected. And that leads right into how do we collect that data? A lot of these are options that came up in discussions with other people. So these are things that people are using in distance learning. We did a session on this with our mentees, our first and second year teachers, and some of these are ideas that came from them. Many of them are. Also, some of them are ones that came from the registration form, where I asked if people had good ideas of things that they were doing during distance learning to collect data. So you'll see some of those on here too. But using parent report instead of direct data collection, sort of an indirect way to get at that data. Taking direct data like you would, kind of instead of sitting with the student, being live on a session for Meet or Zoom. People have said that they've got notebooks with one page for each day, kind of like that digital one that I just showed you from the CEC, but hard copy. Google Forms, so that every time you're working with a student, you're going in there and filling out that Google form of what they did. So a way for a teacher to sort of enter that data. Seesaw and some of these other online tools actually have kind of built-in ways to do some of that data collection, essentially having the student record what they're doing and then submitting that. So basically, then you could be tallying while you watch that or getting that data from that video. Someone shared that in Birth to Two, planning ahead and setting up a time that is in a broad activity to be able to observe multiple things. So it's like, I've got 12 objectives. How am I going to collect data on all of those? Well, setting up a time that you could meet with that student where you could maybe target multiple of those things. The list keeps going. Using a Google Doc to be able to list those goals and objectives there, and then just making a copy with a new date each time you needed to. On a community site, some people have a teacher sending photos that then could be forwarded on to another service provider, and videos would be another way to do that. Boom cards, which we had Stacia Spies talk about, those actually have some built-in data collection right in there. So as a student was using those boom cards, there would be data collection right in that. There's the skills portion of Seesaw. Someone had shared that they can just rate each skill that they've tagged, and then you can log that progress over time. Regular communication with students, parents, and other teachers. This is, I think, a big piece where it's so important to rely on your team to be collecting some of that data too. And this runs across the board for different models of service delivery and for different ages. For example, some of the teachers in middle or high school, you might be case managing and be the person who ultimately is required to report that data back, or ultimately required to say, yes, this is the assistive technology tool we need. But that actual practice or whatever it is that they're doing might be happening in a different classroom. And so you might be relying on that other teacher or a para that's in that room, but someone else might actually be the person doing that direct data collection. And then another great one came in, a class list with spaces for writing and collecting data each day. Having it all on one piece of paper has been helpful. And I definitely agree. The fewer places I've got to look, for me, is definitely a helpful piece. But here's the basics of data collection, whether for an assistive technology tool or for anything else. You have to figure out where you are, your baseline data. Then you decide where you want to go. That's your task, or what is it you want to change, and then figure out how you're going to get there. And that's your tool in the SET framework. What are we going to do to try to increase that ability to do that task? Then you're measuring along the way and adjusting accordingly. Okay, we totally saw that this tool is actually decreasing the student's performance. Of course, we're not going to continue to use that. We're going to trial something else or troubleshoot what it was about that particular thing that wasn't working. So that's kind of the general idea of data collection, and some of the possible options to adapt it a little bit for distance learning. But what I'd like to do now is to pause for a minute here. And I would like each of you, I'm going to go silent for a minute, each of you to take just a minute, literally, to reflect on a situation that you have currently in whatever model you're in, where you might be able to think about doing more or better data collection. We know that we should be collecting data on all the goals and objectives, on everything. Of course, we kind of frame things in AT office hours about assistive technology. That might be the case for some of you. But just think for 1 minute about a situation where you maybe could improve or change your practice surrounding data collection. And we'll have a little discussion in just a minute.